with thanking you, Nayantara, for joining us today and taking out the time for this. And I'm absolutely thrilled to be welcoming everyone else in the audience who also have expressed their interest and encouragement in these series of talks that we've been hosting. The platform Talks by Women Photographers was conceived with an idea to celebrate the works of women photographers and to familiarize the audience with their incredible contribution to the field of visual storytelling. We've been very excited to curate another week of engaging talks from photographers, photo editors, curators, and experts on photography. Today, we have a very special guest. We have Nayantara Gurung Kakshapati in the house today, who lives in Kathmandu, and that's where she's joining us from, and works at the intersection of visual storytelling, research, pedagogy, and collective action. In 2007, she co-founded Photo Circle, a platform that facilitates learning, exhibition making, and publishing opportunities for Nepali photographers that are working in increasingly transdisciplinary ways. In 2011, she co-founded Nepal Picture Library, a digital archive initiative that works towards diversifying Nepali social and cultural history. Nayantara is also the co-founder and festival director of Photo Kathmandu, an international photo festival that takes place in Kathmandu every 2 years. Welcome, Nayantara, and please feel free to take over from here.
Thank you so much, Samya. So great to be here with you guys. Thank you for this invitation. It's cool what all possibilities have opened up with Zoom and all of these virtual interactions. So it's great to be sharing with you some of the work that we've been doing here in Kathmandu. So I have a presentation that I think I'll just launch into, and then I really hope in the latter half of this session to have this be a more conversational sort of evening. And so if you have questions, thoughts, I'm really looking forward to discussing them with everyone. So let me just share my screen. By way of introduction, I suppose I just wanted to mention this because I do think that it's relevant to some of this work that we're doing with the archive as well. Which is that I started out as an image maker and as a photographer, and slowly I found that my interests started to really diversify, and working with found images, working with researchers, working with other practices that surround sort of image making was something that I started to get more and more interested in. And that's, I think, something that perhaps shapes the archive in quite a direct ways, is that many of us who are working with the archive to create it, to build it really, and to create engagement around it, did start out or are currently also practicing photographers. So that's where Nepal Picture Library really sort of, I think that's where it's anchored. And so really, you know, the commitment to the visual, the commitment to it as a language, as a evidentiary sort of tool, I think germinates from there. So just as a way to introduce the archive, I just also wanted to give you a little bit of backdrop. So here in Kathmandu, we run these sort of three projects, three institutions, three entities. We started out with an informal group, a network of photographers, a collective, if you will, and which is called Photo Circle. And Photo Circle was established in 2007. And then Nepal Picture Library, we formally sort of established it in 2011. And I think it took, you know, I mean, those formative years, those initial few years was really for us a time where we were building community really, and I think examining sort of all of our interests within that community. Like I said, that went beyond just the making of images. And so I'll talk more about the archive, of course. And then we also run this festival, Photo Kathmandu. So these three sort of entities kind of, feed into each other. We are a team who kind of live and work in this space. We are based in Orunthapachok, Damsikil, and it's a 2-floor house that we've rented now for about this is the 11th year we've been on these premises. And, it's a space that houses all of this work. And as a team also, we sort of weave in and out of projects and in and out of entities. So we run, a library there, which is just so mostly a photo book library, but we have other material in it as well. And then off to the side, through that little door, you can see the Nepal Picture Library, which is essentially one room, which is home to the archive. This is just to give you an idea of sort of a sense of what our days and, at Photo Circle, Nepal Picture Library are like. We kind of work around this table, eat around this table. And off to the side there on your right-hand corner is our boss lady of the office, Suntu, who is around on most days. Well, now she started going to school, so she's not with us every day. But her mom works with us, and so she was born and raised at Photo Circle as well. One of our proudest achievements, we should say. And this is the archive, essentially. We are a digital archive. We realized from the get-go that we really don't have the resources, the bandwidth, the capacity to acquire physical material. But we were also really and they might or might not survive for very long. And at those times, we've certainly felt, this tinge of sort of, oh, I really wish we could hang on to some of this stuff, but we really don't have the resources. So we part with whatever comes in. We work primarily with these 2 scanners that you can see. This is a Flextite, a Hasselblad multi-format scanner. That's a flatbed there. It's an Epson. And essentially, those are the 2 main scanning devices. We chose to go with Lightroom just as a simple and straightforward way to manage our catalogs for the archive. Because we did an initial round of research and we realized that there are, many options in terms of softwares available for digital archiving. However, most of them we found to be way beyond our budget, like way too expensive to even imagine procuring, and also be like very heavy duty and beyond sort of most softwares we would look at and we would see like 150 fields and we would be able to fill maybe 5 or 6 of them, and so we were the initial few months, it was quite difficult to try to get our heads around sort of some of these technicalities, but we got some really good advice from several friends who said, keep it simple, keep it light. Lightroom is a great way to export things in various formats. And so we've gone with that and it's worked. On the left, you'll see that column. Each folder essentially is a different contributor. That's kind of how we accession the material. And as you can see, we scan whatever parts of the image that we can. So fronts, backs, when we get specific envelopes or boxes with specific, especially with notes and other information on them, we scan those too. And on the right hand side, as you, I mean, most of you must be here, I mean, know Lightroom, is the metadata. And this, I have to say, is obviously the most challenging part of really populating the archive, is the generating of the metadata, you know, and the annotation of the images. Because when collections come to us, they range, you know, some collections are small collections, it might be a dozen or 20, 30, 50 photographs, but some collections are very large collections, run up into the thousands. And so really being able to sit with contributors to really do the research and the baseline sort of annotation is what takes up most of our time and resources, human resources. So that is just to share a little bit of data and numbers with you. At the moment, we are about 120,000 images into the archive. These are mostly scans, both high-res and low-res that we have. We have more material that is kind of pending and, you know, scheduled material, and most often it's very slow work. But this is what we've gone through. We have 381 collections at the moment, and all of it is about 6.5. You know, 2015, we had this crazy earthquake here, and that's a year when we all really realized, you know, that the need to have multiple backups of this material. So at the moment, we have some friends who are faculty at a university in Australia, and they have very kindly helped us. RMIT, they have a very active photo department, and they've very kindly helped us back this up on Google Space, actually, but that they are eligible to access. This is the team, and you know, I do want to take a little bit of time to introduce you to everyone, because I think everyone who gets involved really shapes the work at the archive. So Divas Rajakesi is our head of research and archives. And Divas is really, you know, like he's really the one shaping and leading the research work. Divas has a background in history and in film and in visual anthropology as well. And Divas joined us formally, let's see, I can't remember the exact year, but probably now it's been 5 years that we've been working together. And since Divas has joined the team, our sort of abilities and our interest and our capacity for more in-depth research has really, really been something that we've been trying to build together. At the moment, the full-time team is Divas Yutsha, who has a background in visual studies. She actually was at JNU until recently. She's finished her master's and come back and joined us, which we're really happy about. Bunu is a photographer, but also has a background in sociology and research. And Shikhar is a photographer, still practicing. And he's the one who really runs and manages the archive, is the chief document controller, and such fancy titles like that we like to give ourselves. Augustia, Dewan, Nikita, Nisha have all been research fellows with us on various projects, including the Feminist Memory Project, which I'd like to share a little bit of today, and some others. And Nishant is our admin chief, and he really makes sure that, you know, the entire archive keeps going. There's a lot of back-end work running this project, this growing institution, and so Nishant is behind a lot of that. I wanted to quickly share a few collections with you, just to give you a sense of sort of the diversity in the archive as well. A lot of the early collections that we started to digitize were collections that belonged to professional Nepali photographers and photojournalists who'd had long careers but did not have archives, personal archives of their own, digitized at least. And so, it was one of the real sort of points of genesis for the archive for us was also a way to um, archive the history and document the history of Nepali photography, because there's very little that has been documented. And so this became a way for us to slowly work with one by one, slowly work with Nepali photographers. And Vikas Rauniar's collection was one of the early collections that we worked on. Vikas Dai has been a working photojournalist for over 30 years. He, about 5 years ago, retired as the photo editor of Kantipur Publications, which is one of the largest English and Nepali dailies here. And his collection spans over 3 decades, but here I've pulled out a selection of images that are particularly starting the early 90s and going into the early 2000s. But that period in particular was a period when he was very active. It was also a period when 1990 was when Nepal, we used to be a proper kingdom until before then, and 1990 was the first big people's movement, and when the king granted constitutional powers over to become a constitutional monarch and handed it over to a democratically elected government. And so that was our very first decade of our early democracy. And that was when media really opened up for the first time, when street politics was really at its very nascent sort of early democratic period. And so Vikas Rauniar was really, kept documenting that decade, and the very quick changes that were happening politically, socially, economically in Nepal. And so this is a collection that's really important to us. I think these were also the early years of when the Maoist insurgency began to take root in the country. Officially, the insurgency began in 1996. This image, for example, is one of the early cultural events that were organized by the party, by the Maoist party, to recruit a lot of people into the party. And there's a lot of material. It's been shown. We've shown it as an exhibition. We would love one day to work on a larger book project with Bigasai. But I wanted to give you a quick glimpse of his work. This is another project, collection that is that's really important to us, because Sumitra Manandar Gurung is not a professional photographer. In fact, she started out as a geographer, a political geographer, and a researcher. And so her collection is a real mix of personal family photos, photographs that she was taking when she was training to be a geographer, doing her bachelor's and her master's at Tribhuvan University, going out into the field. And this was a time, in the mid to late 70s, when there weren't two women doing this, and so she was a young woman from a pretty traditional Newar family from the Kathmandu Valley, and her family that she was born into and grew up in didn't have too many women and she was one of the early ones who actually went to university, and certainly one of the early first women from her family to sort of be a professional, out in the world. And so this collection really has this incredible sense of straddling, traditions and sort of life in a very traditional Buddhist Newar family, versus really charting new territories for herself as a political geographer. As then later on, she went for further studies. She left the country, went to the US, ended up working all over the world actually, and then came back to Nepal to continue working in Nepal as in various capacities. She also joined politics at one point, and now she runs an extremely successful women's co-op. So she works, in finance, so to speak, but really working with women across Nepal, and really, you know, tackling this issue of sort of capital and how the lack of capital, despite so many empowering experiences women might have in their lives, if they don't have the capital to really put some of their sort of dreams and action, possible projects into action, that's what they lack. So that's what she works with women on now. This is another collection that came to us, and it was this incredible discovery because an old man, American guy, sitting in somewhere in Vermont, had been scanning images for the last couple of years. His name is Doug Hall. He himself is an ex-Peace Corps volunteer. And then he began to contact ex-Peace Corps volunteers who are scattered all over the world now, but began sort of collecting their images from their time period in Nepal. The Peace Corps program was in Nepal in the 60s, 70s, and 80s mostly, into the 90s as well, I think. But it's these earlier years that these images capture that are incredibly valuable to us as an archive, because, these volunteers were sent out into remote areas of the country and were working in education. They were building bridges, they were working with farmers, they were living with the families, many of whom continued to stay on with even after their positions expired. And so these photographs, and I think there are about almost 20,000 images in this collection, is this incredibly rich repository of a period of time that we would otherwise not have access to visually, because photography was not accessible to the common person across the country, and because technology was very inaccessible. And so we are constantly going back to these images for various projects that we are working on, including the Dalit History Project that we worked on, and images like this particular one here were really at the heart of that project, because otherwise, without this collection, I think that project would have been very, very difficult to visualize. So, the archive is really home to collections from photographers, researchers, a lot of studio collections, lots of family albums, and also people who were collecting on their own, but then didn't know where to take these collections to, have also contributed, and a few institutions. And so the archive is really sort of, at the moment, Nepal Picture Library is really this amalgamation of all of this material. About the first 4 or 5 years of the archive, I think, building the archive, I think we were taking in most material that was coming to us, whether they were coming in from families or individuals, etc. And then around 5 years ago, that's when we really began to sit down and sort of take stock and ask ourselves the question, well, what kind of an archive are we? Like, what are we trying to do really? What do we say yes to? What do we say no to? We can't possibly archive everything that comes to us, because it was really around that point that we began to realize that Now that slowly word had gotten out and people had started to gotten to know about this work that we were doing, people were really like, just, we were being really overwhelmed with the amount of material that was coming in. And so that's when we really sort of went back to the drawing boards a little bit and started to think about this idea of how we are not a state archive. We are not an archive that exists to promote any particular political agenda other than the one of sort of inclusion, right? And I think for us in Nepal, the last 2-3 decades has been really about people really fighting for a more inclusive state structure, but also more inclusive society. And so for us, so much of history has been about sort of mainstream history of people in power. And so with Nepal Picture Library, the work that we were doing, it was really about trying to look at histories in the margins, trying to look at a more inclusive cultural and social history. And so the Dalit project was one of the first projects that we made a really concerted effort to look at a particular history within, a larger social cultural history. And Divas led this project, and it was really something that led to a lot of learning for us on the team. It really stretched us in ways where we were having to imagine looking for and finding images where there were no images that existed. And so I think this is a project that has really set the ground for us. It became an exhibition. It's become a book. It's really something that we want to continue to work on creating engagement around. The Feminist Memory Project followed the Dalit project, and I think a lot of what we learned working on the Dalit project, we were able to implement here. I will speak a little bit more in detail about the Feminist Memory Project further down. These are two more recent research projects that we are currently working on. Indigenous Past Sustainable Futures aims to really look at ideas around indigeneity, ideas around sustainability, ideas around knowledge production, the hierarchy that exists within knowledge production systems, and to connect some of these things to ideas around the future, because so much of indigenous knowledge is constantly always linked to the past. The Kathmandu Valley Urban History Project is also an ongoing project. We're really sort of focusing on the valley, focusing on several campaigns that are being run in the valley right now that look at critical issues of urban space, open space planning. At the moment, we are running an online seminar because quite a bit of the field research work has unfortunately been halted. But the online seminar has become a really good way for us to just pause, read and think and talk together a little bit. And we're really hoping that this seminar is going to help us shape some of this research interest in more specific ways, and really allows us a time to get to know each other as researchers and as visual practitioners as well. So these are all ongoing projects. The Feminist Memory Project. So this is something that we started in 2018. It's a work that I think all of us have different kinds of investments in, but that is very, very close to our hearts. It's ongoing. We've just begun the second phase of research for this work. But it's really an effort to create a dedicated archive for women's history and for the feminist movement in Nepal. And it really pushes forward ideas around visibility for women, of publicness for women, and what that means, what that has meant for movement building, what that has meant for the sort of liberation of everyday sort of lives as well, what that has allowed for in terms of learning, in terms of political participation of women, in terms of women speaking their mind and having opinions and putting them out there publicly. It has made an effort to document and sort of excavate histories of particular events, histories of particular peasants' revolts. For example, this set of images is these are images of women who led a particular a revolt, really, in an area called Bang in Karzahi. The movement was later called the Karzahi movement. That led to quite a bit of land reform in that particular area, part of the country. And these are histories that, growing up, that I certainly never came across, that most of us as young Nepali students who study history, for example, in school, really do not have access to. And so the project has really been an effort to kind of excavate these histories and make them available for all sorts of purposes, make them available for mainstream history makers, make them available for further academia, make them available for the public, make them available for media, and certainly make them available for educators. This is a particular group of people that we are very keen to work with. I'll speak a little bit more about some of our special interests in sort of in education and curriculum building. These are just some images from kind of behind the scenes stuff, the first phase of research for the Feminist Memory Project. We amassed material from about 108. So this is something I'd just thrown up there. About 108 official contributors. This was a database that was created that basically allows anyone at this point, researchers, others who are interested to engage with this material, to come in and deep dive into any of these collections and to reach out to any of these contributors. So you will see here, it's a whole range of individuals, of political leaders. G-Font is a trade union. They contributed to the project. There were writers, there were researchers, women who had been part of grassroots sort of NGO movements and work for many, many years, journalists. Yeah. So this kind of sort of, slow but hopefully thorough database building is something that we hope to create in addition to the visuals and the visual material that the projects archive, so that we can offer them to people who are interested to engage. So this is kind of what we do. We make exhibitions, we make books. We're really keen to advance sort of more thinking around these visual materials and visuals in general, visual culture at large as well. We're really keen to work with teachers and on curriculum building, and we've also been setting up fellowships and residencies as and when we can. So yeah, some of this these images I'll just throw out, and as you have a look at them, I think just to sort of towards the end of this presentation, say that for us, the archive is really something that, we want to keep alive. We want this to be a sort of dialogic process. It's not something that is static and that, we just sort of, digitize and dump and digitize and dump. We're really, really keen to create quick turnaround periods for engagement. So, as soon as material comes in, we are very quickly sometimes already exhibiting or already beginning to publish in mainstream media or think about other kinds of publishing projects, because we really feel that um, we want to reach diverse publics, we want to reach diverse audiences. This commitment to the public is something that is very, very much sort of where our work is rooted. And it's really, when every time we put work out, we realize that we learn more about the material. People are constantly walking up to images to say, that is my great uncle, or this was the neighborhood that my father grew up in, or this woman was my mother's teacher, or so this process of sort of almost crowdsourcing information and knowledge has just been an ongoing thing. We've invited artists during Photo Kathmandu, but also at other points of time, to engage with the archive in different ways. Like I said, we've been publishing. Something we're really keen to do and we've started working on is thinking about making children's books with some of this material. And so that's something we're working on this year, and hopefully in the coming years as well. These are some of the teacher seminars. This is Niranjan and Shara Ray Bhattacharya, both very dear friends and educators who have really led some of our curriculum building and teachers training projects. We've been trying to engage with teachers, but also directly with young people and students, because it's really when we go into classrooms that I think we feel the full potential of what some of this material um, can make possible for young minds. Really a curiosity for who we are, where we come from, a curiosity to ask more questions of ourselves, of family, of home, and to really sort of dig into personal histories and think beyond and think critically and think beyond just what is being sort of um, what mainstream education is usually sort of constricting our thinking to be. That's the website. We're working on a new one at the moment. Our long-term sort of dream and goal is to have the entire archive be available online. At the moment, there are only about 30 collections on the website. But the hope is to have open access for the entire archive in the next year or so. I think I'll end there and hopefully we can chat a little bit. Thank you so much.
Wow, it's been amazing looking at all these archives and the depth of your research to put all of them together. Thank you so much for showing this to us today. Uh, you've kind of shown the screenshots of the databases of people who've contributed to the archives. Also, I believe you've exhibited the Feminist Memory Project at Photo Kathmandu in 2018. So that exhibition was divided into 6 thematic sections. It was Women of the People, Reading Under the Candlelight, Women for Women, Words of Women, A Room of One's Own, and Out in the World. Now, when you're dwelling with, like I saw in the database where, it mentioned what all the people have contributed. One of them said photographs plus suicide note plus diary, When you're dealing with dwelling somewhere in the intersection of research, photography, and archives, and when you're curating a body of work such as that, what are the curatorial decisions that you have to take in order to balance out the 3 media, the various media that you're working with, and how do you put it together finally?
Yeah, no, the material that surround the visual media, right? Like the letters, the diaries are so rich and so important, I think, to the archive at large. And Diwas has really been, like, he's the champ, really. I mean, he digs deep. This kind of research requires a lot of time. The entire first phase of the research, the team was 4 people. Divas was leading the team, Agastya Thapa, Nikita, and Nisha Rai. It was 4 of them, and they worked probably for about 5 months, 4.5, 5 months, kind of 7 days a week, because they were really visiting people, going into homes, spending hours and days with them. Um, and the material that was being unearthed was, really, the richness of it is only because of that time that is put into, the conversations, the stories that come out, etc. The challenge certainly is to how to balance the visual with everything else. But what we started finding is that a lot of the letters, the documents that we were finding were also very visual material, right? So when we were scanning these images, they had texture, and they have, when you look at them, they tell you about time, and they tell you about certain, situations, like what kind of paper was this being written on, what kind of a pen, or was were they using, and so the richness, the information that visually that you can get from looking at documents was also really rich. And so we made an effort to include things like letters also as visual pieces, in the material. There is certainly a lot of text in this project, because we need to know about the lives of these women, these histories, obviously. Um, we've also done quite a bit of oral history interviews, and some of that was incorporated into the exhibition, but a lot of it we weren't able to, because that particular exhibition took place mostly in the outdoors, and so incorporating audio in public spaces was a bit challenging. But there is an archive of these interviews as well, and so it's something that we would love to work on. We're hoping to really work on to create sort of multimedia pieces and audio archive in itself. And I think the layers that are created within an archive, with all of this material, is what really opens it up to then so many possibilities of engagement. Um, yeah.
And I also want to question you on something you just said. I'm just thinking while you talk about it is, did your decision to acquire the letters and the diaries, was that a curatorial decision, or was this something that you're already doing, and then when the curation happened, it became handy, you know?
It was very much part of the very initial research, the very initial sort of archive building that was happening, and then curatorially we had to take decisions whether or not to include this material. Sometimes the material, the letters and all of this sort of added to, right, the visuals. And sometimes the density of the content was not something that could be presented, say, in that particular chapter. And sometimes a letter could like open up a whole new sort of Pandora's box, and take us in a whole new direction as well. So I think the non-visual, I don't know, for the lack of a better term, content that was archived was very much part of the very initial archiving efforts.
Also, even with the feminist project, the Feminist Memory Project, and even with all the archives of Dalits, uh, there's that sense that you have of, inclusion. So you're clearly trying to work on the history of Nepal and talk about it through communities which often not get represented in that narrative, but which also means that this documentation or these archives are not readily available. So there's an immense amount of research that goes into procuring them. Can you talk about the process, and how did you really go about acquiring the archives and reaching out to the people who would probably have them?
I think before we started the research, there was put together a reading seminar for all of us, and we started out by really sort of taking time to read about some of this kind of research work that has already taken place, to read about sort of visual culture, to read about um, different approaches to visual archives as well, to think more about the vernacular image, to think more about sort of family albums and the possibilities that they might open up. Then we opened up a call for researchers, and from that pool of people who had participated in the seminar, but also a wider pool, people applied. And it was really very exciting to see the number of applications and the kinds of people who were applying, because this is work that hasn't really happened in Nepal. I mean, and we are also fairly new, but we got some pretty serious sort of researchers applying. The challenge, however, was that very few people are used to working through the visual, and so the visual is often just sort of an illustrative add-on element, that comes in most research kind of processes, that comes kind of at the very end, just to kind of add to a report or something like this, right? Whereas we were really trying to lead with the visual, and so finding people who had worked in that way was quite a challenge. But the team that we did end up setting up was a really, really interesting team, because Nisha came from a background of working in radio, actually. So she had no experience working with the visual, but then her sort of engagement on the ground in terms of her journalistic skills and her networks across Nepal were really, really strong. At that point, she'd already worked in community radio for about 10 years. Agastya came from she just finished her PhD at JNU from the School of Arts and Aesthetics. So she came from a deeply rooted visual sort of studies background, and to have a mix of all of these sort of skill sets and interests, I think was really interesting. It really, really shaped the project. Something that we were kind of clear about from the beginning was a lot of what has happened in Nepal in terms of looking at women's history up until this point has been kind of this effort to celebrate, and there's nothing wrong with that, right? But kind of the first woman to do this, the first woman to do that. These kind of iconic figures that we end up creating through our narrativizing, through our storytelling, and the kind of canons that then get built around these figures. And so I think quite early on we kind of set ourselves up in a way where we would end up having to have some pretty difficult conversations around why we might not be interested in the archive of, let's say, a really big shot feminist leader, for example, versus a woman who nobody had ever heard about. And so some of that politics within the feminist movement did play out. We were given access to certain material and not given access to certain material because people weren't quite happy with the way we were approaching some of this history, and so I think there were some of these key sort of key ideas that were shaping the research. One is to really, kind of challenge some of the canonization that was taking place. be to really approach it from a multi-dimensional sort of also multimedia sort of a sense. So yeah, I think it was a lot of snowballing also that happened. Each woman the team would meet with would tell the team about 10 more women who the team should go meet. And so these 108 contributors to the exhibition, the archive actually has a lot more contributors. At the moment, the Feminist Memory Project collection has about close to 7,000 images. But these 108, when we start like the second phase of research now, there's a list about 3 times, I think, the size of that, that we already got, from the first round, that we can start with now. So yeah, I don't know if that answered your question,
Sure,
actually.
sure, it does. Uh, One thing that I'm also wondering is, you're working across many disciplines. You've done an exhibition out of it. You've published books. You're talking about getting them into the mainstream education. What in your mind is the audience for a visual archive like this, and how far would you like to see it go? How would you, are you just aiming at certain communities, or do you think that it's something that should be there as a core of Nepal history, and therefore you'd like to infiltrate the places of, let's say, education, or what are the places you'd like to reach with this?
Yeah, I mean, curriculum is definitely something we would love to get into. We've been working um, on projects for the last several years, trying to reach out to the CDC, which is the Curriculum Development Center here under the Ministry of Education. Trying to understand the way this industry of textbook making works, trying to sort of create networks that would allow us to work with people. There's unfortunately so much politics involved in all of this, like who gets the textbook deals, what gets in there and what does not, so on and so forth. So I think it's taken us really time to really understand how it works. And then we've done a lot of these pilot projects that we've taken to them to say, well, what would it take for us to, would, first of all, are you interested? And interestingly, they've always said yes. I think there is a real interest in sort of having curriculum be more inclusive, etc. But the processes are so challenging. Here in Nepal, um, so it's like every grade subject, let's say social studies grade 7, right? Every grade subject gets revised once in 10 years, because they wait for like this cyclic period to come, and then once in 10 years there's like a actual assessment and a revision of that curriculum. And so we were really trying to figure out timing, figure out, all these schedules, to see if some of these ad hoc projects that we've been doing can actually go into national curriculum. And so that is something certainly we are keen to explore further. Having said that, alongside, parallel to that sort of mainstream education, we also continue to work with friends and colleagues who work in education in different ways, not necessarily in mainstream education, but as extracurricular stuff, as outside, like out of classroom teaching learning projects, working on teachers training, etc. So that work is also happening. For us in Nepal, we do have a national archive. However, the National Archive doesn't really have a visual archive. It has a very small collection of what they call a visual archive. They are mostly manuscripts that have been preserved. And so if one really wants to do research, as as a journalist or a scholar or a teacher, or a photographer, there's very little scope for that. And so I think slowly we're beginning to realize that there are one or two other institutions in the country who are working on visual material as well. And so the more we work together, I think the more possibilities will open up in terms of mainstreaming some of this work as well.
At this point, Nayantara, I'd like to bring in some questions from the audience. Aparna Nori has a question for you. She says, "Thank you, Nayantara, for generously sharing this rich and inspiring journey with all of us. Can you take us through the process of how the team goes about fact checking for dates, locations, and photographers in case of images, especially if material that comes to you from large, not so well documented collections?"
Yes, that's a real challenge. The fact checking, the dates, etc. Most often because memory is something that we can and cannot rely on. I'll give you an example of one particular collection where the photographer whose collection it was had given us a range of dates, and we were planning on an exhibition of his work. And so there was a young researcher who we had brought on board to try to fact check, and we realized that about maybe 80% of the dates that the photographer had provided us were not accurate. But then again, it's very difficult to base that on anything also, because for generic material, how do you fact check, right? And we do so, kind of as a policy, we do rely primarily on the primary contributor, which is if that is the photographer, or if it's a personal family album, or the family member who has brought it into the archive. And we also want to go kind of beyond just you know dates. I mean, we are looking at more larger narratives that evolve over larger periods of time as well. And so dates are important for specific things, and less important for other things. And so I think that's been our approach, given the limitations that we have to work with. Locations, again, we rely on the primary contributor, and as and when we can fact check, we do. But again, the larger narrative that we are trying to sort of build around the material is something then we prioritize, that these facts may or may not impact directly.
Oh, when you were beginning this archive and you thought of creating the visual archive, I'm reminded of something that Tanvi said a couple of days back on this forum. She said the personal archives of people often would just dwell on happy moments and they would omit a past part of the reality, right? So was that something that bothered you about the personal archives that you were acquiring, that they would probably not depict the stories that you wanted to tell?
Certainly. I'll give you another example. There was a collection that came into the archive, um, where the photographer had uh, like so he gave us about 80% of the material, and then he had been hanging on to one bag of stuff that he just would refuse to hand over for for the longest time. And it was only about a year and a half into the whole exercise that we began to realize that there was stuff in that particular bag that was extremely disturbing for the family, because there was a second family that this man had, and there were images that belonged to this second family, and these were images that he did not want to make public, to the family, right? He didn't want to open it up, etc. So certainly, I mean, family albums have a lot in them, and they omit a lot for sure, as well. But the omissions and the kind of gaps also tell stories in a strange way, you know. And I think for us with that particular collection, it was really about, well, how far do we want to push, you know, what right do we have to sort of ask some of these questions, if at all. And it was really, you know, the prerogative of the contributor um, to give us a version of their family history that he chose to, right? And so I think these are certainly things that keep coming up, but we honor and we address um, as and how possible.
Uh, Ruchir Dwivedi has a question. Are all these archives accessible online to public now?
Not everything is accessible online. As I said, we're working towards that, but it's going to take us at least a year, I think. We have just started um, the process. But there are about 30 collections online on our website at the moment. And as and when people um, send in requests, we are happy to share our catalog as a PDF. We're also happy to share content, images and metadata as per request. So sometimes what happens is people visit us on site. Let's say you're a researcher or you're a student studying somewhere away, and then you get a sense of what is in the archive, and then you sort of keep in touch with us over email, and we keep sending. You send us keywords, we respond with certain material that we have. You send us specific interests that or requests, and we respond on email. But the goal is eventually to be able to make stuff available.
We have a suggestion slash question from Samar Jodha. He's asking, have you folks been writing for funding from European and Japanese photography and archival foundations?
Um, Not specifically photography and archive foundations, but we have worked with an institution like the Prince Claus Fund, for example, which is a Dutch organization. And they're one of the few that fund culture in this specific way. And it was their generous grant that enabled us to buy our first set of hardware. And so the two scanners that you saw earlier, etc. But so far, not put specific foundations. In fact, I don't know too many of them. So I'd love to, if you have specific names or suggestions, I'd love to.
I think I should connect you with Samar Jodha.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Please.
There's another question from Hadao. Hi Nayantara, can you share your process of transitioning from an image maker to someone who works with images across disciplines? From your own experience, is there any existing tension or hierarchy between these two positions?
Tension or hierarchy? It's a good one. Um, Maybe I'll just start there. Unfortunately, I mean, I don't know. You know, I think many of us have had different experiences, but I am cognizant of the fact that unfortunately there is hierarchy, right? Somehow a curator is much higher than an image maker or an editor, so on and so forth. And I have questioned this and sort of thought a lot about how that shapes engagement and shapes work as well, and shapes larger communities as well. And so that's something that um, I am I have been thinking about a lot. My own transition is wasn't necessarily an easy one. I think I struggled for a while. I had a lot of guilt that I was kind of like giving up on my image making, and I kept. I kept kind of almost blaming this other work for keeping me away from my image making, etc. But I think it took me a couple of years to really realize that I actually really enjoyed this other engagement as well. And that actually I was making these choices like subconsciously also, I think, a lot of the time. Because I really enjoyed this other aspect of the work as well. Um, a large part of it also came from having to just do it because, you know, we'd set up this organization. Um, when you set something up from scratch, you end up having to do many, many things that you don't necessarily enjoy doing. A lot of the admin, a lot of logistics, you know, well, who's going to write the proposal and who's going to write the report, you know, well, I guess I'm going to do it, you know. So a lot of it was that for sure. But I think a couple of years into it, I began to realize that, you know, I was actually being able to shape things and because there were, you know, certain outlooks and certain ideas and certain kind of a certain kind of imagination of this work, um, given my kind of roots in understanding image making, that I was able to do, I think. So it's been a slightly fraught process, but now I think I'm really finally at peace with it, you know, and something quite early on in my kind of image making um, uh, career uh, that influenced me, I think, was I went to this conference, and uh, it was a conference that was being organized by what is now Seven, you know, the agency. And there were a bunch of people up there speaking, which including like some of the Seven photographers, but also like this photo editor and all these people. And this one particular woman, she was, I think, at the time the photo editor at Time magazine, threw this question out and she said, how many people in this room want to be a photographer? And it was literally like, you know, packed room, and literally every single person raised their hand. And and then she started talking about, you know, well, you know, who's going to then be the picture editor, and who's going to be like the designer who's going to work with the photographer, and who's going to be like, you know, all these other people, all these other roles that need to be played for a larger ecosystem to be built, right? A larger industry to be built. And and here, I mean, at least for us, certainly here at home in Nepal, that ecosystem isn't very strong yet, right? We don't have all these people who will play these supporting roles for us, and so we're having to constantly do that ourselves, which has its plus and its minuses. But I think that is something that keep that experience I keep going back to, and I think yeah, all in terms of wearing different hats, I think I am much more at peace with now.
Aditi, Shiva wants to know, would you be able to share more about your approach to circulating the archive and its materials with the media? What the reception and coverage is like, and also whether in outreach, including exhibitions, there are issues of censorship or self-censorship to contend with?
Yes. These have been tricky and challenging, as well as sort of gratifying. I mean, both ways. The challenges have really been that mainstream media, like the newspapers and the magazines that we try to circulate with, they pay very little for images. You know, at best they pay 500 rupees per image that they use, and most often they would prefer to use an image for free. And so on the one hand, we really want to put these images and this archive into circulation. On the other hand, we really also want to, you know, fight the good fight to make sure that image makers get paid for their work, and that images are not just like free things flying around on the internet. And so I think that tightrope has been really challenging. We have, to some extent, been able to build relationships of trust with specific editors who do contribute sometimes in different ways. Of course, there is the very easy sort of off the cuff sort of attitude of, well, we are giving you space, and well, we are giving you exposure, for sure, which is a constant battle. But I think for us, images that come into the archive, we deal with, I mean, we work with in a certain way. And then we also, as Photo Circle, work with a large community of contemporary practitioners. And that work and that material we are working with in specific ways. And so sometimes, I mean, we sign agreements with every single contributor who contributes to the archive, and they give us, copyright is always theirs. They retain full copyrights to the work. They give us specific usage rights, to publish, um, to to exhibit, to publish locally, internationally, so on and so forth. And so they do give us some rights, and sometimes some people reserve some rights. And so we work accordingly.
Satya Teja Ravi is asking, would love to visit your place one day. Do you take damaged negatives and work on them? And also, do you return the negatives to photographer or store at your own archives?
We return everything. Like I was saying earlier, we just don't have the infrastructure to preserve material and to store material, and to retain a physical archive. We also have very little skill sets and very little resources to restore damaged material. So whether they're negatives or prints, we are not, we don't have any expertise in restoration work. And so when damaged material does come into the archive, we actually digitize and scan the material just as it is, because in so many ways, that damage actually also tells the story of that image and that material, and where it came from and what conditions it lived in for the many years that it probably lived in. And so that's what we're able to do, and that's also what we choose to do. We sometimes do, obviously, try to fix some images digitally, as and when necessary, but even things like dust marks and scratches and damages that are not too drastic, sometimes we choose to retain in the exhibition prints and in the publications that we put out.
Uh, Bharat Ramamrutham has a comment plus question. He says, powerful initiative to discover, establish, and reinforce the Nepali identity, especially amongst its youth. Amazing work. But are young people really interested?
Yeah, they're surprisingly interested. And like the strangest things seem to, like spark their interest and spark their imagination. Sometimes it's like the clothes that people are wearing in the photographs, and at other times it's yeah, like we all relate to visual material in such different ways, right? Like the older people, they will automatically kind of go into nostalgia mode, and they will, the younger people will connect on a very retro mode, and they will like identify certain visual cues and visual clues in really like unexpected ways. I think it's interesting to have sort of intergenerational groups of people responding to the work, and it's really interesting to see the differences, but also sometimes then the similarities in what they're responding to as well.
I think we'll make this one the last question. It's basically a repeat of what has already been asked, but I think the attendee wants you to elaborate a little more on that bit. Uh, Thanks for sharing your experiences. Before the talk started, you talked about all the other functions supporting visual arts apart from image making. Could you talk a little more about that?
Oh yeah. Um, so, I mean, that conversation started when I was asking everyone who's running this show, the talks with women photographers, if they were all photographers, right? And I mean, this platform and this initiative is so amazing, and it requires a whole set of skills, right, to take projects like this forward. And so um, I think we've been finding that, you know, I also started out introducing the Nepal Picture Library team just to point out to everyone. I think that some of us, like Shikhar and myself and some others, are or started out as photographers or are still practicing photographers, but we still work on the archive full time or part time, etc. As photographers, we are perfectly capable to do other things as well sometimes, and we're really interested to do other things as well. And I think it's exciting to see photographers, you know, open up these other channels of interest and purpose as well. And so, and sometimes, you know, like, and also increasingly, I think all over the world, not just in our parts, I think it's a challenge just to sustain yourself on photography, whether you're freelancing or full-timing, wherever. So I think if you do have a wider set of skills, you're able to actually sustain a photography practice, as we all know, much easier. But I think consciously, like, why always have that be sort of this plan B option, right? I think consciously, um, why not? For, you know, photo practitioners could be thinking about other roles that they want to or enjoy taking on, whether it's with the design or more with the technological aspect of things, with the research, with the writing, with the marketing, with somebody's got to bring in the money as well. With, I mean, yeah. So, and again, what I was saying earlier, which I said, which was really thinking of this as, you know, as an ecosystem, and building this as any healthy ecosystem, like finding balances um, between various roles and responsibilities as well.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Nayantara, for this very detailed and insightful conversation. It's been an
Thank you.
absolute pleasure to host you.
Thanks, Soumya. It's been really, I hope next time we get to chat a bit about your work too.
I'd love that. Thank you so much. I'd also like to thank the audience for being present here today, for all the wonderful questions they've posted, which has made this conversation even more interesting. Before we sign off for the day, I would like to introduce the team behind Talks by Women Photographers. We have Anjali, who's a one-person tech support for these talks. We have Geetika, who's our design expert, and Gurpreet, who's our social media expert. I also want to extend a special thanks to Mr. Amit Mehra, who's been an advisor on these talks and has been very uh, intricately involved with most of the decisions related to these talks. Thank you so much. This has been the last talk of the second phase of Talks by Women Photographers. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. And we do promise to be back with more talks. So please keep following us, and we'll keep you posted about whatever is scheduled for the next few days. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good night. Have a good day for people in the other part of the world. And we'll see you soon.
Thank you, guys.